My husband walked out of my father's funeral to go on a trip with his mistress. But at 3:00 a.m. I received a text from the father I thought was dead. I'm still alive. Come to the cemetery quietly. Today, I want to tell you the story of my life. A story that still gives me goosebumps. Before I got married, I thought I was the luckiest woman in the world. My future husband, Ethan, and I had been dating for 3 years, long enough to believe our love was destiny. Ethan was gentle, thoughtful, and always seemed to put my needs before anyone else's. His mother, Eleanor, showered me with praise the first time we met. My dear, you have such a radiant face and you speak with such grace. I'm absolutely charmed by you. Hearing that, my heart blossomed, and I felt truly blessed. Back then, I told my father, CEO Matthew Harrison, Dad, if I marry Ethan, I know I'll live a peaceful life. My father just smiled sweetly. If you're happy, I'm happy. But when you get married, try to be a little selfish for your own sake. Don't live your life just enduring things. I laughed, thinking my father worried too much. In front of me, Ethan had always been impeccable, a perfect and well-spoken man. After the wedding, following a family tradition of theirs, I moved into my in-laws' home. The house where Eleanor lived was a grand historic family home in Chestnut Hill, remodeled with a stately touch. Though beautiful on the outside, the first time I set foot inside, a strange chill ran down my spine. I calmed myself, thinking it was just the unfamiliarity of my new life. But, as they say, time reveals all truths. After a few weeks of living there, I realized that chill was not a figment of my imagination. Eleanor's attitude changed overnight. At first, she called me my sweet girl. But the next day it became Clara. And a few days later, the comments began. Clara, can't you get these dishes a bit cleaner? Clara, why does it take you so long to do anything? The tone itself wasn't harsh, but the intent was as sharp as a needle. Anyone who's been in a similar situation will understand. Some words hurt more than a physical blow. My husband, Ethan, transformed into a completely different person from the man I fell in love with. There were no more texts asking if I'd eaten. No more loving glances. When he came home from work, he would shut himself in his room and not come out. If I knocked on his door for dinner, he'd reply with annoyance. Even on the days he had dinner out, he'd lie, saying, "The meeting ran late." I knew, but I said nothing. A woman in love tends to be weak. I thought that if my husband was working so hard, I should be able to endure these small things. I remember one drizzly evening, I rushed to bring in some blankets for my mother-in-law, who was always cold. Seeing me, she said, "I'm not asking you to do everything, but this house has its own way of doing things. A daughter-in-law should have the initiative to get things done without being told. No one likes an idle person." I gritted my teeth and replied with a smile, "Yes. I'll keep that in mind." I felt a tightness in my chest. I worked all day at my job and rushed home to make dinner. I was never idle. But I didn't want to worry my parents. So I endured. My father used to tell me, being too good isn't always a virtue. But if you're okay with it, then it's okay. Until that moment, I believed that if I was patient, my in-laws would eventually come to appreciate me. But no matter how hard I tried, that connection never came. The distance with Ethan grew more apparent each day. His phone was always face down, and if I walked into the room, he'd lock it instantly. Once I cautiously asked him, "Are you hiding something from me?" He snapped back, "Don't create drama." From that day on, we lived like strangers in the same house, each locked in our own world. I told myself it was just an adjustment phase. that everything would go back to normal. But the situation only worsened. One day, as I was bringing some fruit to my mother-in-law's room, I overheard her on the phone. "She's so foolishly good-natured. Who knows how long she'll last in this house?" From the other side of the door, I felt my heart stop. It wasn't that she spoke ill of me that saddened me, but the realization that my hopes had been in vain. Despite these incidents, I thought they were all just small tests. I was still young, hopeful, and believed in the value of the word family. Not even in my worst nightmares could I have imagined that all of this was merely the prologue to the tragedy that was about to unfold. I didn't know that a dark abyss was opening before me, one that would swallow my life whole and destroy my faith in marriage and in people. If I had known, I would have never continued down that path. But I suppose that's life. You can measure the depth of a river, but you can't fathom the heart of a person. And it all began to crumble on the day I least expected it. That morning, the sky was overcast. A bad omen. As I was preparing breakfast, my phone rang incessantly. It was Peter, my father's driver for years. Normally a very calm man. His voice was trembling that day. "Mrs. Miller, please stay calm. Mr. Harrison. Mr. Harrison has been in an accident." I froze and everything went dark. I didn't even hear the clatter of the silverware falling from my hands. I kept asking questions, but my mind was a blank slate, as if filled with cotton. Only the word accident echoed in my head. Ethan came out of his room, frowning at the commotion. I told him through sobs, "Honey, my father's been in an accident." Without a word of comfort, he replied with icy coldness, "Oh, well, we'll stop by later." My mother-in-law looked at me as if I had interrupted her breakfast and said, "A grown woman shouldn't cry like that. Calm down. Your father is getting on in years. It was probably just his own carelessness." Her words stabbed me like daggers, but I was in such a state of shock that I couldn't react. I rushed out and hailed a cab to my parents' house. When I arrived, people were already coming and going with somber faces. Peter ran to support me. According to the police, the president's car went off a curve on the mountain pass in the Burkess. The driver is unconscious and Mr. Harrison, they couldn't find him in one piece. I collapsed to the floor. In that instant, I felt a pain so sharp it was as if someone was squeezing my heart. It was true what they say. Losing a father is like having the pillar of your home crumble. I felt the world tilt beneath my feet. That afternoon, Father Michael, a priest very close to our family, appeared. Dressed in his brown cassock, he murmured prayers. He said he had heard the news at the parish, had arrived at the accident scene early, and had recovered the ashes so the soul of the deceased could rest in peace. My hands trembled as I saw the white urn on the altar. I never imagined I would be confronted with my father's remains so abruptly and absurdly. The wake was filled with employees from my father's company, business partners, and acquaintances. The funeral was grand, befitting a businessman of his stature. The scent of lilies permeated everything, and the line of people offering condolences was endless. But among all the floral wreaths and compassionate glances, I felt incredibly small and alone. I was cold to the bone, as if that urn had absorbed all the warmth from my body. I expected Ethan to be by my side, to hold my hand. But he didn't show up all day. He didn't answer my calls or reply to my texts. I tried to make excuses to convince myself he was busy with an important meeting. Then I heard some company employees whispering behind me, "But what is Ethan doing in the Bahamas during his father-in-law's funeral? You haven't seen it. He looked pretty cozy with some young woman." I turned my head. On their phone screen, I saw a picture of Ethan grinning from ear to ear, his arm around a young woman's waist at a beach resort. It was from that very day. At the same time my father was being mourned. I felt a dull thud in my head. I grabbed a chair to keep from falling. I couldn't believe it. I, who had loved him so much, who had placed all my faith in this marriage. I went back inside to hide the humiliation that burned within me. My mother-in-law, seeing my pale face, shot me a look and said, "Ethan is an adult. He has his own life. Don't make a scene at the funeral." Her words were like salt in the wound. My lips trembled as I managed to smile. I just wanted to know where he was. My mother-in-law crossed her legs and calmly poured herself some tea. He's on vacation. He needed to de-stress. He's been working very hard. Besides, you're handling the funeral just fine, aren't you? The night wore on and the attendees began to leave. I sat by the altar looking at my father's portrait and wept inconsolably. Father Michael came and went through the house reciting his prayers. But his eyes kept glancing at the envelopes with donations as if he were calculating. Around 3:00 a.m. Exhausted, I curled up on a sofa, shivering under a thin blanket. My tears had not yet dried when my phone vibrated once. I reached out and picked it up. It was an unknown number. The message was just a few words. "Clara, it's Dad. I'm not dead. Come to the family cemetery. Quietly. Tell no one." A shiver ran down my spine. My eyes widened so much I nearly dropped the phone. I reread every word, trembling from head to toe. It was without a doubt my father's way of writing the use of spaces. The way he called me. There was no doubt. A lump formed in my throat and my heart was pounding, about to burst. My father was alive. I leaped up as if I'd been struck by lightning. That short message danced in my mind, each letter a blade stabbing at my heart. How could my father not be dead? But a part of me, my instinct, knew it was him. Anyone could imitate his style, but not to the point of replicating his characteristic pauses, his punctuation, his way of phrasing things. My hands holding the phone trembled so much I had to grip the arm of the sofa to keep from falling. At that moment the house was in a sepulchral silence, broken only by the whistle of the wind seeping through the cracks of the old wooden doors and the rhythmic sound of Father Michael's rosary beads as he prayed by the altar. The dense smell of lies turned my stomach and my head was a chaotic mess. Calm down, I told myself. If my father was really alive, it meant someone wanted the world to believe he was dead. And that meant the accident hadn't been just an accident. I swallowed hard and stood up silently. The moment my feet touched the floor, my mother-in-law opened her bedroom door slightly. Her gaze was as sharp as a knife. "Clara, what are you doing up at this hour?" I jumped and replied, "Oh, I have a headache and wanted to get some fresh air." She scanned me from head to toe and said sharply, "Don't wander around the house at night. At a wake, one must avoid bad omens." I lowered my head, but inside my heart was burning. I returned to the sofa and pretended to lie down, waiting for her to close the door. When the sound of her slippers faded away, I opened my phone again. The message still glowed on the black screen. I held my breath and decided to contact the only person I could trust at that moment. My father's loyal assistant, Mark. I sent him a text asking him to discreetly meet me in the backyard immediately. 5 minutes later, Mark appeared. His face was pale from the sleepless night. He looked at me with concern. What's wrong? Why call me so urgently? You gave me a scare." I showed him the phone. As he read the message, his eyes widened. "This can't be. I don't have this number saved. But this is definitely the president's way of writing," I said in a low, trembling voice. "Mark, do you remember last night you said the security camera at the cemetery was flickering? You suspected someone had tampered with it." Mark nodded quickly. "Yes, that's right. When we went to the estate to leave the offerings, The camera flickered as if something was blocking it or someone stood in front of the lens. I looked him straight in the eyes. Then if my father is alive, it means someone tried to kill him and wants the world to believe he's dead. Mark swallowed hard. What are you going to do? I exhaled and answered with a single word. Go. The two of us stealthily opened the back door. The moon was hidden by clouds. And the night was frigid. The family cemetery was located behind a small hill just a few hundred yards from the house. But in that atmosphere of mourning, the path felt much eerier with the sound of insects and the prayers drifting from the house. As we neared the cemetery, Mark grabbed my arm. I just checked the recording again. There's a gap of exactly 1 minute where the screen goes black. It coincides with the time you received the message. I felt my hair stand on end. And my heart pounded furiously. I looked around. But I could only hear the rustling of leaves in the wind. The cemetery was in shadows. The only light was the faint yellowish glow from a small lamp lit in front of a statue of the Virgin Mary. And then I saw it. The freshly dug grave with my father's name. Matthew Harrison. Engraved on the headstone. My whole body trembled. And I felt a tightness in my chest. I approached and placed my hand on the still damp earth. If my father was alive, what was in that urn? And who had claimed it was him? Before I could sort through my thoughts, I heard a rustling in the bushes behind me. I spun around and Mark switched on his flashlight. From where the light pointed, a staggering figure emerged. His clothes were torn, and his face was covered in bruises and wounds. But his eyes were the same eyes I had seen for over 20 years. Dad. The word barely came out. I ran to him as if my life were collapsing in that very moment. I hugged him tightly, feeling my hot tears fall on the back of my hand. My father gasped and in a hoarse voice he said, "Clara. It's me. I'm still alive. Those bastards tried to kill me. Listen to me carefully." I cried silently, terrified someone might hear us. "Dad. What happened? Who did this to you?" He squeezed my hand and with his last bit of strength pronounced each word. "Ethan and his mother. They are not who you think they are." I felt as if my heart was being ripped from my chest. I didn't fully understand his words at that moment. But I had a visceral certainty. My in-laws had not only been cruel to me, but also to my father. And everything I had considered a tragedy was merely the prelude to what was to come. I stood frozen in the middle of the cold cemetery. I was still hugging my father, afraid that if I let him go, he would disappear. Mark quickly took off his coat and put it over him. My father leaned against a tree, breathing heavily. His body was covered in scratches and bruises with dried blood on some of the wounds. Seeing him so weak broke my soul. "Dad, who did this to you? Tell me," I begged, my voice cracking. He closed his eyes, struggling to inhale the cold air. His voice was a whisper, but every word was seared into my heart. "It wasn't an accident. Sweetheart. It was a trap. They tried to kill me." The night wind blew through the bushes, and the rustling leaves sounded like someone sobbing. Mark leaned in concerned. "Mr. Harrison. Who was it? Please tell us in detail so we can get you to a safe place." My father opened his eyes and looked at both of us for a long moment before uttering one by one words that weighed like stones. "Ethan and his mother and Mr. Ortiz and Father Michael. They tried to hurt me." I felt like my head was going to explode. I shook it vehemently. "No. That can't be. My mother-in-law and Ethan wouldn't do that." "Dad." My father raised a hand and placed it on my head. His voice was grave, a mixture of disappointment and pain. "Clara. You still trust people too much. Elena and Ethan only care about their own interests. I discovered they were embezzling funds from the company and leaking contracts. Before I could take action, they struck first." He paused, breathing with difficulty. His voice was raspy, as if his throat were injured. Mr. Ortiz devised the plan. Stage a car accident and send an unidentified body to the crematorium. Father Michael would handle receiving the ashes and the paperwork. That way, everyone would believe I was dead. I bit my lip. I tasted the metallic tang of blood, but felt nothing. Every word from my father was a hammer blow, shattering the naive faith I had in my in-laws. But how did you escape, Dad? My voice was a trembling thread. Leaning against the tree, he slowly pieced together his memories. Just before the car went over the cliff, I sensed something was wrong. I yelled at the driver to brake, but he was already drugged. The car lost control and slid towards the edge of the road. On impact, I was thrown out. I put a hand to my chest. Just imagining the scene made me feel faint. I was knocked unconscious in the bushes at the bottom of the ravine. Luckily, a local who was out early setting bird traps found me and saw I was still breathing. They took me to a makeshift cabin, gave me water, and did some basic first aid. But I couldn't reveal my identity. I was afraid they would come back to finish the job. Mark gritted his teeth. Mr. Harrison. Then they're far more evil than we thought. Where have you been hiding all this time? My father looked around and whispered as if afraid someone would hear him. In the woods. Behind the cemetery. During the day, I hid. And at night, I came out to watch. Today, seeing the funeral at your house and my picture on the altar, I knew their plan had almost succeeded. I broke down, crying. Dad, why didn't you let me know sooner? I really thought you were dead. He took my hand and said in a choked voice, I couldn't. You were in their house. I was afraid they would hurt you first. I felt in his touch the bitterness of a father betrayed to the end. A man who had lived his whole life with integrity, who had helped countless people, only to be stabbed in the back by those he had treated best. Mark nodded with determination. Mr. Harrison, you can't stay here. I'll take you to an old warehouse we have behind the factory. No one will see you there. And you'll be safe. My father looked at me as if waiting for my response. I wiped my tears and said, I'll take care of you, Dad. I'll protect you no matter what. In that instant, I realized I was no longer the submissive, patient daughter-in-law. I had to face the truth. My in-laws were not just cruel. They were people who had attempted to take my father's life, who wanted to strip my family of all its assets and power. I walked, supporting my father step by step through the thin mist. With each step, I swore to myself that I would never let them walk all over me again. We took my father to the safe haven. As Mark tended to his wounds, I watched them. A storm raging inside me. I knew my life had reached a point of no return. And ahead of me was a war I never thought I would have to fight, a war against the very people who once called me family. When I helped my father into the old warehouse behind the factory, a place where time seemed to have stood still, my heart was pounding. The walls were stained, and a faint yellow light flickered. Mark. My father and I sat for a moment to calm ourselves. The smell of the disinfectant Mark was applying to my father's wounds mixed with the cold air seeping through the cracks, creating a pungent odor. My father took my hand and said in a hoarse voice, Clara, from now on, you have to be very careful. Go back to your in-laws' house and act like you know nothing. Just like always. No one must suspect you know anything. I nodded. But a fear I had never felt before grew inside me. Every breath, every glance in that house terrified me. Everything I had naively believed in terrified me. Mark added, Tomorrow I'll bring medicine, food, and more blankets. Mr. Harrison, you need to rest for a few days. Don't worry. I'll take care of him. My father sighed and patted Mark on the shoulder. Mark, I'll never forget this. And you, Clara. If I'm alive, it's because of you too. I placed my hand over my father's in silence. My heart felt as heavy as a lead weight. I had never wished for morning to come so badly. I had to get back to my in-laws' house before anyone noticed. As dawn began to break, a fog covered the dirt road outside the factory. I put on my coat and pulled a hat down to cover half my face. As I slipped out the back door, my heart beat like a drum. If my mother-in-law or anyone in the house found out I'd been out all night, everything would be ruined. I walked a short distance and stopped panting. Silver streaks were beginning to appear in the sky and the neighborhood roosters started to crow. The cold air on my face helped me think more clearly. You have to act perfectly. No one, absolutely no one, can suspect you've come from the cemetery. When I stealthily entered the house, the wall clock read 5:15. The kitchen was dark. The only sound was my mother-in-law lifting the lid of a pot. Seeing me, she stopped dead. Her piercing gaze scanned me from head to toe, searching for something out of place. Clara, you're just getting in now. Her voice was as sharp as vinegar. I lowered my head and replied, yes. I was in the backyard. I felt so awful last night and couldn't sleep. I went for a little walk and I'm feeling better now. She let out and continued chopping scallions. We are in mourning. If a neighbor sees you wandering around alone at night, they'll talk. I bowed my head. I'm sorry. As I said, I'm sorry. I felt a pain in my chest. What had I done wrong? I had lost my father. I had cried until my eyes were swollen. I had spent a sleepless night. And still, I had to bow my head to remain in that house in silence. Just then, Ethan came downstairs. He was in a t-shirt and shorts, looking as relaxed as someone who had slept soundly. Seeing me, he frowned slightly. What's with your appearance? Haven't you looked in a mirror? I gritted my teeth to keep from crying in front of him. I didn't sleep well last night. Ethan yawned. I was with a business partner last night and drank too much. I don't think I can make it to your father's place today. You go and make excuses for me. I forced myself not to look at him. If I did, the rage would make me collapse. A business partner. The woman he was with at a resort in the Bahamas was a business partner. But I had to pretend I knew nothing. Absolutely nothing. I replied, okay. My voice trembled as I said those few words. My mother-in-law immediately intervened. Ethan has a lot of work. There are plenty of people at your parents' house. They'll manage. Don't burden your husband. In another time, I would have choked on my own words. But that morning in my heart, instead of sadness, there was a sense of betrayal that chilled me to the bone. Still, I suppressed my emotions. I had to make them believe I was weak, naive, and knew nothing. Yes. I understand. Eleanor didn't know that at that moment a silent war had begun in my mind. The very war they had pushed me into. During the funeral service that morning, I received the guests. My eyes were swollen. But I didn't let my guard down for a second. Father Michael had arrived early, twirling his rosary beads and reciting prayers. His compassionate expression seemed incredibly hypocritical. He hovered around the altar, collecting donation envelopes as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Seeing him sent a shiver down my spine. He had personally brought the fake ashes of my father to this house. He had lied without batting an eye in front of hundreds of people. He was an accomplice to an attempted murder. And now he was here posing as a venerable priest. The indignation choked me. My father was alive, hiding for his life. And those who tried to kill him were standing so calmly before me. I promised myself, Clara, from today on, you are no longer the good daughter-in-law. You will make them fear even looking you in the eye. But to achieve that, I first had to pretend to be extremely weak, naive, and harmless. Only when they let their guard down could I strike where it hurt the most. This war was silent, but fiercer than any other, and I had just taken my first step. My father's funeral services continued late into the night. The flow of visitors coming to pay their respects was constant. However, the people who should have been by my side in my moment of greatest pain were absent. My husband Ethan on a trip with his mistress, and my mother-in-law, Eleanor, who, although present, was as cold as an iceberg. As evening fell, I feigned exhaustion and said I was retiring to my room to rest. My mother-in-law examined me from head to toe and then handed me a cold, damp towel. Here, Clara. Wipe your face to reduce the swelling. If people see you like this, they'll think we're mistreating you in this house. Her voice was softer than usual, but her gaze was as sharp as a razor. I knew she was testing me. I bowed my head, accepted the towel, and replied softly, "Yes. Thank you." Once in my room, I closed the door carefully. My heart was pounding, about to burst. I had been on edge all day, playing the role of a fragile daughter-in-law, but I had to stay strong. My father was in hiding. I didn't know how far the people who wanted to harm him would go. I sat on the bed and took a deep breath. Mark had sent me a message saying my father was sleeping and his condition was stable. As long as he was safe, I could keep going. Just as I was about to lie down, I heard voices coming from my mother-in-law's room. They were speaking softly, but the old structure of the house allowed the sound to filter through clearly, and every word reached my ears. "Are you sure she still doesn't suspect anything?" The voice that answered was Ethan's. I froze. When had he come home? "She's too foolish to notice anything, Mom. She's too busy crying at the funeral to figure anything out." My hands clutched the quilt until my knuckles turned white. My mother-in-law laughed disdainfully. "If she were smart, do you think I would have accepted her as a daughter-in-law? Don't worry. This matter needs to be settled. It would be a shame if that company didn't become ours." I felt my blood boil. Not only had they tried to kill my father and abandoned me in my worst moment, but they were also talking about me as if I were a mere tool. Ethan continued with complete nonchalance. "But Mom, is the cremation certificate legitimate?" Then another voice joined the conversation. A voice so familiar it made the hair on my neck stand up. It was Father Michael. He whispered, "I've taken care of everything. The ashes were delivered according to procedure, so no one can verify anything. There are plenty of unidentified bodies. You just have to find the right time for the cremation." I had to cover my mouth tightly to keep from screaming. It was him. He had swapped the ashes of a stranger for my father's. My mother-in-law lowered her voice. "Father, you've done a good job. When this is all over, we won't forget your help. But you must be discreet." Father Michael chuckled. "With a parishioner as generous as you, do you think I'd be foolish enough to ruin everything?" My hands and feet went cold. He was someone who had received a lot of help from my father. And now, simply for money and personal gain, he had sided with those who were trying to take his life. Ethan lowered his voice. "If Clara finds out about this, we're finished," my mother-in-law replied instantly. "And what is she going to know? She believes, hook, line, and sinker, that the ashes the father brought are authentic more than she believes in herself. Let her cry for a few days. She'll get tired of it and move on." Ethan scoffed. "You're right, Mom. If I'm just a little nicer to her, she'll believe me blindly." I bit my lips until they bled. All of Ethan's tenderness and consideration over the past years had been a sham, and my mother-in-law had seen me as an easy-to-manage servant. They never considered me part of the family. Father Michael's voice spoke again. "But remember, you haven't taken over the company yet. If the old power of attorney documents from President Harrison turn up, his daughter will have the inheritance rights. We need to get rid of that girl. My heart stopped. Get rid of. My mother-in-law let out a dry laugh. Don't worry, Father. I can bend this daughter-in-law to my will whenever I want. And if she doesn't obey, well, there are other ways. I couldn't listen anymore. My ears felt plugged as if an invisible hand were squeezing my heart. I shot up from the bed and backed away as if fleeing a wild beast. In the darkness, I covered my mouth to stifle the sobs that fought to escape. They were planning to take everything. They treated others' lives as if they were nothing. I thought of my father and shuddered. If I hadn't gone to the cemetery the night before, if my father hadn't sent me that message, right now, he would be considered ashes. And I would undoubtedly be the next target. I heard footsteps in my mother-in-law's room. I scrambled back into bed and pulled the blanket over my head. My heart was beating so fast. I could hear it thumping in my chest. My bedroom door opened slightly, and a shadow peered in for a few seconds before closing it. I don't know with what eyes they looked at me, but one thing was clear. They considered me an obstacle, and obstacles had to be removed. In that very instant, I knew my life was going to change completely. I could no longer be good. I could no longer endure. A single moment of weakness could make me lose everything. Silently, I clenched my fists and made a vow. Clara, from now on, you have to live differently. Not just to save your father, but to save yourself. The next morning, I woke up with swollen eyes. My head was heavy from the sleepless night. Having overheard the confession they thought was secret, a ray of sunlight streamed through the crack in the wooden window, making dust motes dance like a shimmering haze. I got up and took a deep breath, trying to regain my composure. You have to act. You have to play the part of the naive, fragile daughter-in-law, who knows nothing. Only then will they let their guard down. When I went down to the kitchen, my mother-in-law was already sitting there. Her hair was pulled back in a flawless bun, and her face was as serene as if the terrible conversation from the previous night had never happened. Seeing me, she managed to smile. You look a little better today, Clara. I bowed my head and replied softly, yes, I'm better. As I was about to turn away, she stopped me. There's a lot to do today as well. So go and receive the guests. If a woman spends all day crying, people will mock her and call her weak. I bit my lip until it almost bled. But I still answered in a gentle voice. Yes, I understand. I remembered an old saying. Softness overcomes hardness. To defeat the wicked, sometimes you have to be soft, or at least pretend to be, so they become complacent. At lunchtime, I began to watch every glance. When there was a quiet moment with the visitors, I slipped out into the patio. The midday sun filtered through the white smoke of the incense. Everyone who came and went looked at me with pity. Poor girl. What bad luck. Newly married and already in mourning. But no one knew my pain was much greater. While trying to maintain an expression of exhaustion, I struggled not to reveal the tension running through my veins. I watched my mother-in-law making calls with a calculating expression. Ethan looking at his phone more than at the guests. And Father Michael appearing out of nowhere, only to glance at the donation box. I memorized every one of their gestures. Their furtive glances. Their casual comments. They were all clues. Suddenly, I realized something. My mother-in-law, Ethan, and Father Michael were too calm. Too calm for a fatal car accident. For such a solemn funeral. And above all, for the death of the man who paid their salaries. That calmness was the proof that it was all a charade. In the afternoon, I went to the company in my role as a grieving daughter. I wanted to keep them as a memento. My mother-in-law looked at me with the suspicion of someone who had been in business for decades. Thinking about papers at a time like this. Focus on the funeral as you should. I bowed my head and said in a choked voice. Yes. It's just I just want to keep something more of my father. She stared at me for a long time. Then sighed. All right. But come back soon. As I turned, I saw her expression relax. She thought I was still naive. When I arrived at the company, everyone was surprised to see me. They bowed their heads in greeting, their eyes full of compassion. I just nodded slightly, trying to maintain the sad expression my role required. But in reality, I had come with another purpose. I went straight to my father's office. As I opened the door, the familiar smell of wood hit me, making my heart ache. The chair where he sat was in its place, and the papers were as tidy as if he had been working there the day before. I silently promised, Dad, I will bring the truth back to this place. Mark followed me in and closed the door. In a low voice, he said, I brought a USB drive. Maybe we can recover some of the deleted files. I nodded. We both started to go through the data on my father's computer. Many files had been deleted, but luckily not all of them. Mark exclaimed softly, Look at this. These are the leaked contracts. This signature is Ethan's. My hands trembled. He opened another file. Mark examined it and said, These are the transfer records to Father Michael's parish. The amounts are more than 5 times higher than a normal donation. My blood ran cold. Mark whispered, his voice trembling. This is irrefutable proof. I took a deep breath. Save everything. Don't miss a thing. I glanced around the office. For years, my father had protected the company from this very spot. Now it was my turn to finish the job in his name. The journey back to my in-laws' house was like walking into the lion's den. After a long day, I returned. As I entered, I saw Ethan watching TV with his feet on a table. He looked at me as if he owned the place. And where have you been all day? You didn't even help my mother greet the guests. I swallowed my anger. I'm sorry. I went to the company to get some of my father's papers. My mother-in-law coming out of her room heard my words and raised an eyebrow. What papers? What for? Take care of the funeral and stop with this nonsense. Clara. I bowed my head. Yes. I just missed Dad so much. As I said it, I forced my eyes to well up with tears. I saw my mother-in-law's gaze soften a little. It's easy to bully the good-natured. She must have thought. But I was different. I was acting and they were buying at hook, line, and sinker. That night, lying in bed, I could clearly hear my own heartbeat. Heavy, fast, but stronger than ever. From the moment I left the cemetery the night before, I knew I had entered a war with no return. And the daughter-in-law of that house, the good woman, they had always looked down on that same woman, would be the one to make them pay for their sins. On a grey morning, the wind blew coldly. On the altar, the consumed incense still released a thin trail of smoke. I stood in front of the mirror, fixing my disheveled hair, striving to look like a daughter, devastated by the loss of her father. But deep in my eyes, there was a coldness and a steely determination that no one could perceive. Today was the day I had to go to the company. Right when my husband's family would be holding a secret meeting to seize power. I knew perfectly well that if I let my guard down for a single moment, they would consider me a nuisance and get rid of me. Just as they had discussed the night before, I dressed in a simple black suit and following the mourning customs, covered my head with a veil. When I came out to the living room, my mother-in-law examined me and said, Clara, there will be a lot of people at the company today. So behave yourself. We are in mourning. Be careful not to cause any gossip. I nodded gently. Yes. I understand. Inside, I thought, if protocol will keep me alive, I'll endure a little longer. At the company, the atmosphere of conspiracy was as thick as fog. As soon as I entered the lobby, several pairs of eyes locked onto me. Employees loyal to my father approached. Mrs. Miller, are you all right? We are so sorry about your father. I nodded slightly, but didn't break down, even though I felt a lump in my throat. Thank you for your concern. My father wouldn't want to see me weak either. I headed straight for the boardroom. The door was ajar, and from within came Ethan's cold voice. Although the funeral isn't over yet, business can't stop. As family, I will temporarily assume leadership. I paused for a few seconds before the door, took a deep breath, and pushed it open. The screech of a chair broke the silence, and several people jumped. Ethan saw me and was momentarily stunned, but he quickly regained his composure. Clara, what are you doing here? You're in mourning. I looked at him. My eyes reflected sadness, but the sword in my heart was sharp. Please continue. I want to hear what's so urgent for all of you when it hasn't even been a week since my father's death. The room fell silent. No one expected me to show up at that moment. My mother-in-law, sitting at the far end, turned slightly pale, but she forced herself to raise her voice. Clara, this is a company matter. This is no place for you to interfere. I walked slowly towards the long table and placed my hands on its cold surface. My voice was low, but every word was clear. Yes. But my father left a will, and until it's made public, no one can unilaterally assume leadership. Isn't that right? Several executives exchanged glances. They knew I was right. Ethan gritted his teeth. Clara, don't make a scene. I managed a faint smile. It was the first time I had smiled after days of incessant crying. I'm not making a scene. I'm just reminding you of the law. Besides, there are too many suspicious points about my father's accident. Just then, the phone in my pocket vibrated. It was a message from Mark. The police are in the lobby. They say they received an anonymous tip. I didn't know who had placed it, but it was clearly the turning point I needed. I looked up and said softly, "Oh, it seems the police have arrived. I'm not sure if it's about some financial matter within the company or if it has to do with the priest who brought us my father's ashes." The face of Father Michael, who was sitting at the back, turned white as a sheet. He nervously adjusted his sleeve, and sweat seeped through the folds of his clothing. The room was instantly filled with a suffocating tension. Ethan jumped to his feet. "What are you implying?" "Clara," I looked him straight in the eye and slowly but firmly said, "I'm not implying anything. As you all know, the accident happened at night on a mountain pass. How is it possible that in less than a day the ashes appeared and the cremation certificate was perfectly ready?" My mother-in-law gripped the edge of the table, her lips trembling. "Watch your words, Clara." I paused and continued. "Yes. I also hope everything will be clarified with transparency. If there have been any abnormal fund transfers within the company related to the church or the leaking of contracts." Before I could finish, Father Michael shot up and nervously said, I have an urgent matter. I have to go." No one said anything, but everyone knew. He who has something to hide gives himself away. Ethan quickly approached and grabbed my wrist forcefully. "Stop it. Don't ruin my plans." I looked at him with empty eyes. "Ruin? I'm just helping everyone see things more clearly." At that moment, an employee opened the door and peeked his head in. "Excuse me. The police are asking for a few people to come downstairs." In that instant, I clearly saw the panic in my in-laws' eyes, and I knew I had won the first battle of this war. After the tense meeting at the company, The atmosphere at my in-laws' house was like a calm lake before a storm. On the surface, tranquility reigned. But underneath the currents were turbulent. I could clearly feel that they had started to suspect me. They had realized I was no longer the naive and fragile daughter-in-law from before. That night, as I was arranging my morning clothes in the room, Ethan came in. He slammed the door shut, making me jump. "Clara, what the hell did you do at the company today?" His voice was a low growl. I looked up and put on my most innocent expression. "I just asked about things that worried me. My father is dead." Ethan cut me off with a dark look. "Cut the crap. This is too big for you to get involved in." In that moment, I realized there was no love left in his eyes. Only threat, annoyance, and fear. He was afraid I knew too much. Calmly, I said, "I just want justice for my father." Ethan's face contorted. I couldn't tell if it was from rage or worry. He came closer and in a low but knife-sharp voice said, "Clara, don't force me to do something I'll regret." His warning sent a chill down my spine. I looked at the floor so he wouldn't see me trembling. "Okay." Ethan turned and left, slamming the door with such force that the room echoed with his anger. That night, as I went down to the kitchen for water, I heard my mother-in-law's voice in the living room. I hid behind a column, my heart pounding. There were 3 people in the room: my mother-in-law, Ethan, and Mr. Ortiz, the business partner my father had suspected. Mr. Ortiz's voice was horsero. "This Clara girl is becoming a problem. She's found out too much too quickly." My mother-in-law sighed. "I thought she was docile, but I never imagined she'd be so persistent. After how she challenged us at the company today, it's clear she's dangerous." Ethan grumbled. "Mom, she has something like a USB drive. I'm sure she copied my father's computer." My heart skipped a beat. They knew. They knew I held what terrified them. Mr. Ortiz scoffed. "There's no other choice now. Keeping that girl alive is a risk for us." I felt my legs give way. My mother-in-law asked calmly, "What do you mean?" Mr. Ortiz replied firmly, "We have to get rid of her." I had to cover my mouth to keep from screaming. The daughter-in-law they once called charming had become a thorn that had to be pulled out. Ethan didn't object. He uttered a sentence that froze my heart. "I'll take care of it as long as you're not implicated." "Mom." My mother-in-law nodded thoughtfully. "But it has to be a clean job. No one can suspect." Mr. Ortiz's voice sounded again. "I have someone reliable. A guy who specializes in these jobs and leaves no trace." I recognized the name of hired thug who had been mentioned in the news. If they involved him, I wouldn't stand a chance. Near midnight, I heard the front door open slightly. I peeked through the curtain and looked down. Mr. Ortiz was getting into his car while my mother-in-law and Ethan saw him off. I heard Ethan ask in a low voice, "So, will everything be taken care of by tomorrow night?" Mr. Ortiz nodded. "Yes. Tell the girl to take an offering to the church. The preacher will intercept her on the way." My legs failed me and I had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. Their plan was to lure me out alone, kidnap me, and eliminate me. I was trembling so much I felt nauseous. But I gritted my teeth. "Don't fall apart. You have to survive to save your father and to expose these people." As soon as I was back in my room, I received a text from Mark. Mr. Harrison says, "The camera angle near the warehouse has been moved since this afternoon. Someone left a mark. Be careful." Not only was I in danger, but my father was also being watched. I replied quickly, "Keep a close watch on my father. If anything happens, let me know immediately." I turned off my phone. I felt exhausted, but my mind was more determined than ever. I was no longer the daughter-in-law who only knew how to endure. If I wanted to live, I had to be smarter, faster, and perhaps a little more ruthless than them. I repeated to myself, to defeat the enemy without, you must first conquer the enemy within. I couldn't sleep that night. The whole house seemed quiet, but it was filled with the scent of conspiracy, crime, and heinous betrayal. And I knew it. Tomorrow they would act, and that would be the greatest test of my life. The next evening, the sky was lean, threatening rain, and the wind howled with a mournful whistle through the trees lining the alley. An unusual chill for early winter made me shiver. But what froze me most was the plan my in-laws had hatched the night before. Lure me out of the house to hand me over to someone called the preacher, a man with a reputation for dirty work. I knew perfectly well they would act today. But I also knew I had to face it. If I didn't fall into their trap, they would find another perhaps worse way. Around 7:00 p.m., as I was cleaning the kitchen, Ethan came down, sighed with a look of feigned remorse, and said, "Clara, could you go to Father Michael's church tonight and leave an offering for your father? I have an urgent meeting." Hearing him, my heart leaped. It was exactly what Mr. Ortiz had ordered the night before. I looked up, forcing a naive expression. Why? Why do I have to go alone? It's already dark." Ethan frowned impatiently. "You're a grown woman. I told you I have work. If you don't want to help, then don't." My mother-in-law, who was in the living room, intervened. Her voice was as calm as a pond. "Clara, it'll just take a moment. The church is right nearby. A good wife should take care of household matters." I looked at them as if they were strangers. But I still bowed my head and replied softly, "Yes, I'll go." As I walked out the door, I saw a faint smile on my mother-in-law's lips. A light smile, but as cold as ice. I knew that in her eyes, I was someone who wouldn't be coming back that night. I walked to the corner of the alley. As soon as I was out of their sight, I took out my phone and sent a quick message to Mark. "They've started to move. Activate my father's tracker, and keep him safe. If I don't answer my phone, call the police immediately." Before I could put my phone away, a small van pulled up beside me. Without giving me time to react, a black cloth was thrown over my head and someone grabbed me from behind. I was roughly pushed into the vehicle and the door slammed shut. Stale air. The smell of sweat and gasoline. I tried to scream, but my mouth was covered. A man's hoarse voice said, "Stay still. If you scream again, I'll tie you up." The preacher. It was his voice, the one I'd heard about in the news. The van sped down an empty road. I was tossed from side to side, feeling like my limbs would break. But amidst the chaos, I clearly heard what the man in the passenger seat said. Mr. Ortiz said, "It has to be a clean job tonight. That little brat can't open her mouth again." I bit my lips until they bled, my heart racing. It was all darkness, as if hundreds of invisible hands were dragging me into an abyss. About 30 minutes later, the van stopped. I was dragged out, the smell of insects, damp earth, old fabric. We were in an abandoned warehouse. When the cloth was removed from my head, I saw fierce faces under a dim, gloomy yellow light. I trembled. Not from fear, but from rage. Rage that they dared to treat my life as if it were a rag. The preacher pushed me onto a wooden chair. "Smart girl. You know too much." I didn't answer. I stared him straight in the eyes without flinching. He scoffed. "So brave. But it won't do you any good. Today is your last day." The warehouse door opened and my mother-in-law walked in. Behind her, Father Michael in his brown cassock. His face was pale, but his eyes were cunning. And finally, Ethan entered. The 3 people who were once my family now revealed their true faces in the darkness. My mother-in-law crossed her arms and stood before me. "Clara, you've disappointed me greatly." I laughed. "No. The thing is, I've become a nuisance to you." Father Michael said anxiously. "That girl knows about the ashes. She knows too much. If we don't get rid of her, everything will fall apart." I turned my head towards him. "A man of God who swaps ashes and covers up a murder. How can you pray and ask for others?" He took a step back, his face livid. My mother-in-law slammed the table. "Enough of this nonsense. You've become insolent since you found out the truth. You thought you were so smart. But you're just trash that my son and I picked up." Ethan came closer and grabbed my chin forcefully. "Clara, I warned you. You should have stayed quiet." I looked at him with empty eyes. "You've only ever been docile with your mother. To me, you've just been a coward." Just as Ethan raised his hand to hit me, I pressed a small button hidden under my belt. The tracker Mark had installed was activated. In the distance, the sound of an engine approaching at high speed could be heard. Footsteps. Shouts. The warehouse door was kicked open and the light from flashlights blinded us. A police officer's voice boomed. "Everybody freeze. You're under arrest for kidnapping." The preacher jumped up but was on the ground before he could flee. Father Michael put his hands on his head, shouting, I just my mother-in-law was so pale she could barely stand. Ethan was subdued so quickly he couldn't say a word. The warehouse became a scene of chaos and all secrets were exposed on the spot. Phones. Account books. Transaction records. Everything fell into the hands of the police in minutes. I was still sitting with my hands tied. But my tears were not of fear, but of relief. I had survived. I had escaped, and in the end they themselves had handed the evidence over to the police. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Dad, I did it." I remained motionless on the rotten wooden chair. The rope binding my wrists dug into my skin, staining it with blood. But when the warehouse door was kicked down, flashlight beams swept through the darkness, and the sound of police boots stormed the place. I felt as if I were being pulled from the darkest abyss of my life. Death, which I thought was imminent, vanished like a shattered nightmare. The preacher was thrown to the concrete floor in a split second. He shouted, "I didn't do anything." Nothing. But the police gave him no chance to say more. 2 burly officers pinned him down, twisting his arms behind his back. Ethan stood paralyzed, his face pale, beads of sweat on his forehead. He opened his mouth but made no sound until the moment the cold handcuffs clicked onto his wrists. He looked as if he had been struck by lightning. My mother-in-law staggered back, gripping the edge of a table with trembling hands. I had never seen her so undone. She just stammered, "No, it wasn't me. I just," but her excuses were drowned out by the voice of an officer reading her rights. Father Michael nearly fell to his knees from shaking. His brown cassock looked ridiculous in that scene. He clutched his rosary, murmuring nonsensical prayers. "Oh God. Oh God. I just helped. They forced me." The police immediately confiscated his phone and a folder of documents they took from the cloth bag he was carrying. An officer glanced at some papers and looked up with a piercing gaze. "There's an accounting ledger here. 2 transfers from the accounts of Mr. Ortiz, Eleanor Miller, and Ethan Miller. How do you explain this money?" Father Michael's face turned waxing. He collapsed onto the warehouse floor, his hands trembling uncontrollably. I only receive donations," a police officer said coldly. "There are donations of hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time. And what about the fake ashes? It's all noted in this book." Hearing that, a shiver ran through me. He had noted everything. Every time he received money. Every time he carried out a dirty task. Heaven was watching. An officer approached and carefully untied the ropes from my wrists. Are you hurt? I shook my head, though my legs were still trembling. From outside, Mark ran in. His face was pale with worry. Are you okay? They didn't hurt you. Seeing Mark's red-rimmed eyes, I felt my heart soften when I was on the verge of death. He was the only person I trusted. I gasped. Thanks to you. Thanks to you. I'm here. Mark bit his lip and clenched his fists. We also have to thank Peter. He saw a suspicious man lurking near where Mr. Harrison is hiding and alerted me immediately. I had a bad feeling and activated your tracker. And luckily, the police were nearby. Hearing that, I felt like I had been born again. An officer guided me out of the warehouse. The night wind hit my face coldly, but it helped clear my mind. I turned back. The 3 people who once called me family were in handcuffs. Their heads bowed. One was crying. Another was trembling with fear. Another was in a state of panic. But none of their faces inspired pity in me. It was the price they had to pay. I was taken to the police station to give a statement. I told them everything from the moment I received my father's message to the strange meeting at the company to the kidnapping plot that night. When I finished, the officer sitting across from me nodded. Mrs. Miller, your testimony matches the evidence we just seized. And prepare yourself because this isn't a simple kidnapping case, but a possible organized murder conspiracy. I bit my lip. I knew I had seen in their eyes the cruelty of those with no way back. When I left the interrogation room, Peter was waiting for me in the hallway. This middle-aged man who had worked for my father for over 20 years had teary eyes when he saw me. I'm sorry. I couldn't protect you. I shook my head and took his hand. You saved me, Peter. I will never forget it. In the station's courtyard, a strong wind was blowing. I looked up at the dark sky. I had never felt so strong. My body was exhausted and my legs still trembled. But I thought of my father, of the pain he had suffered, and of the moment he would come forward to reveal the whole truth. That night, I had survived. But tomorrow would be the day justice would begin to be on our side. A new, brutal, but hopeful chapter awaited me. The next morning, Mark and I went to police headquarters to give a more detailed statement. As I entered, I saw a person sitting with their back to me. Their graying hair and familiar build made my heart leap. When the person stood up and turned around, I saw it was my father. With a lump in my throat, I could barely manage. Dad. My father smiled. But his eyes were red. He opened his arms, and I hugged him like a child reunited with her father after a long time. His clothes still smelled of disinfectant and the earth from his days on the run. All of it pained and saddened me. He patted my back and said, "Sweetheart, I'm okay. You did so well." Clara. I looked up at his gaunt face. In his eyes, there was no longer the bitterness of the past days, but the determination and strength of a man who was going to reclaim his honor. He put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Today, I will tell them everything." I nodded. Beside us, Mark, also emotional, greeted my father with a trembling voice. My father smiled back at him as if he were his own son. We were led into an interrogation room. On the table in sealed bags were the phones and documents of Father Michael, my mother-in-law, and Ethan. The atmosphere was heavy but solemn. An inspector said, "Mr. Matthew Harrison, we have reviewed Mrs. Miller's statement and all the evidence. To complete the file, we ask you to tell us everything from the beginning." My father took a deep breath and began to speak. About a week before the accident, I noticed something strange in some contracts. Large sums of money had been withdrawn without justification. I started to investigate secretly. My heart lurched. My father continued. I discovered forged signatures on 2 important contracts. The signature was Ethan's. The room fell silent for a few seconds. I felt my heart sink. But I swallowed my tears. It was time to hear the truth. Not to falter. My father went on. I called Ethan to speak with him alone. At first, he denied it. But then I saw the fear in his eyes. Before I could take action, he ran to tell his mother. Eleanor immediately met with Mr. Ortiz. And that's where the conspiracy began. The inspector asked, "Are you certain they conspired to harm you?" My father nodded. "Yes. I overheard one of their calls. Mr. Ortiz said he would prepare the ground. And Eleanor said it had to be done cleanly. They also mentioned Father Michael. They needed a convincing accident and someone trustworthy to deliver the ashes." I clenched my hands until my knuckles turned white. They had planned every step perfectly to cover up their crime. My father recounted slowly, as if reliving the horror of his days as a fugitive. My car had been tampered with, and the driver drugged. I noticed something was wrong and yelled at him to stop. But he was already unconscious. When the car went over, I was thrown from the door. It was Providence. I bowed my head and a tear fell onto the back of my hand. My father continued. Some locals in the woods rescued me. But I knew they would come back to check the area. So I couldn't reveal my identity. I hid in the woods for 3 days and learned they had brought an urn and declared my death. At that moment, I knew I had to be more vigilant than ever. An inspector asked, "Who informed you so you could contact your daughter?" My father looked at me and smiled faintly. "Thanks to the news of the funeral. I heard a group of people talking about the time and that Clara would be at the wake all night. I found an old phone in the cabin and sent a message to my daughter." I squeezed his hand tightly. It had been just a few lines. But they had saved my life. The inspector took out a folder. "Mr. Harrison. On Father Michael's phone. We have all the proof of the transfers. There's also an audio recording where he accepts the task of obtaining fake ashes. And in Eleanor Miller's purse, we found a copy of a contract for asset seizure." My father let out a sigh of relief. But it was tinged with pain. Then they can no longer deny it. I looked at those documents and shuddered. The people who once smiled at me, who ate at the same table as me, who called me daughter-in-law, had tried to murder my father and get rid of me. The inspector concluded, "We will be filing charges for multiple felonies. You and Mrs. Miller will receive protection for the time being. This case involves high-profile individuals, a fraudulent priest, and financial documents. So it is likely to attract a lot of media attention." My father nodded. And I felt a weight lift from my chest. My father was alive. And I had survived. But there were big waves ahead. As we left the headquarters, my father put a hand on my shoulder. "Sweetheart, I'm sorry I put you through something so hard." I shook my head and hugged him. "Dad, if it weren't for you, I would be a real orphan." My father smiled, his gaze as warm as the sun breaking through the clouds. "From now on, no one will ever walk over us again." Outside, the wind blew strongly, making the leaves of the trees whisper. I saw a corner of the sky clear up and felt a peace I hadn't felt in a long time. It was like seeing the first ray of sunlight after a long storm. The war was entering a new phase. One where my father, who was thought to be dead, would face them with his head held high, and I would be by his side, being his shield, as he had been for me all my life. My father returned to the company on a cloudy morning. But the air was exceptionally clear, as if even the sky knew it was an important day. When the police car dropped him at the main entrance, dozens of employees were already waiting outside. They were all speechless when they saw him appear. "Alive." Whispers filled the lobby. "The president is alive." Really? Then the cremation was a lie. My God. Who could be so cruel? I got out first and helped him out. All eyes were on us. Gazes of joy mixed with disbelief. No one could believe that the man whose urn had been brought home was standing there. Thinner than before, but just as imposing. My father greeted the crowd with a slight wave of his hand. His voice was deep and serene. Thank you to everyone who has worried about me these past few days. I have returned today to set things right. The lobby fell silent. The large boardroom had already been prepared at the request of the police. When we entered, I saw my mother-in-law, Ethan, and Father Michael sitting on one side, under guard. All of their faces were livid. Those who were once arrogant and treated me like nothing now bowed their heads as if sensing their end. Ethan looked up when he saw my father. His eyes widened and then he lowered his head again like a cornered animal. My mother-in-law was trembling so much she could barely stand, and Father Michael, with a lost look in his eyes, just murmured nonsensical prayers. I sat next to my father. I felt much stronger. But in a corner of my heart, the pain of betrayal was still an open wound. When the official meeting began, a police inspector stood up. Today we are here to reveal the truth about the accident of President Matthew Harrison and the falsification of his ashes, and to present the evidence related to the seizure of assets, the leaking of contracts, and the conspiracy for organized murder. The atmosphere was as tense as a drawn bow ring, and every word seemed to echo off the ceiling. My father stood up and walked slowly to the front. He placed his hands on the lectern and looked one by one at the employees who had been with him since the company's founding. I, Matthew Harrison, never imagined the day would come when I would have to stand before you under these circumstances. He paused as if a lump were forming in his throat. I saw his eyes moisten. I was the victim of an attack. It was a planned accident. And the most painful part is that the culprits were people I once trusted. The room filled with gasps of astonishment, and many people covered their mouths in disbelief. The inspector presented a folder of documents. This is the proof that Eleanor Miller, Ethan Miller's mother, conspired with Mr. Ortiz and Father Michael to cover up the attempted murder of President Harrison. They used an unidentified body to create fake ashes. A female employee burst into tears. How could they do that to the president? My father turned and looked directly at Ethan. There was no anger in his eyes, only deep disappointment. Ethan, I considered you a son. But for your greed, you have forgotten even the most basic principles of being human. Ethan lowered his head. I saw his shoulders tremble slightly, but I couldn't tell if it was from regret or fear. My father continued. And you, Father Michael, whom I believe to be a moral man, have turned out to be a false clergyman who has used the teachings of God to cover up your own sins. He addressed everyone and raised his voice. Those who have falsified ashes to cover up a crime must be judged by the law. The inspector nodded in confirmation. All those involved are currently in custody and are being investigated according to legal regulations. After the facts were presented, my father took a thick envelope from his briefcase. It was something I had seen before in the safe at home. He held it up. And now I wish to make my new will public. The room filled with murmurs again. My father pronounced each word clearly. All my voting rights, my inherited estate, and my shares will be transferred to my only daughter, Clara Harrison. I was frozen. I didn't know my father had prepared all this before the attack. He continued. To Ethan and Eleanor Miller, I officially revoke all their rights and benefits in this company. As of today, they have no relationship with this company. From my mother-in-law's side, a sob was heard. She broke down, her voice cracking. Mr. Harrison, I'm sorry. But please. My father shook his head. His gaze was sad but firm. Those who have done wrong must pay for it. Ethan bit his lip until it bled. Father Michael, as if he had no escape, closed his eyes and sighed. All the employees stood up and applauded in unison. It wasn't an applause of joy, but an applause because justice was finally being served. I looked at my father. My heart filled with emotion. I felt that all the humiliation and pain accumulated over the last few days had dissipated a little. My father turned to me and said in a low voice, "Sweetheart, from now on, you have to be strong. Not just for me, but for yourself." My eyes filled with tears, and I nodded. He was right. From now on, I would live for myself. The meeting ended. But that was only the beginning of the fall for those who had sided with evil. And I was prepared to make the most important decision of my life. The morning after the will was read, I woke up in my old room at my father's house. But the feeling was completely different. For the first time in weeks, I heard the chirping of birds in the trees outside, and the sun streaming through the window cast a soft light on the thin curtains. The days of waking up with fear, worry, and tension were over. However, my heart was still heavy. Today, I had to do something I should have done a long time ago. I went back to what I once considered my home, my in-laws, to collect my things and confront Ethan one last time. The old rusty iron gate, the wall covered in purple bougainvillea. Everything seemed strange. As soon as I entered the yard, my mother-in-law rushed out of the house. She was still wearing a dark blue house dress, and her face was pale from sleepless nights. She stood in my way and with a look that tried to pierce through me said, "Clara, listen to me." I stopped calmly and with a minimum of courtesy bowed my head slightly. "Yes. Tell me," she gasped. Her voice trembled and pleaded as it never had before. "I was wrong. I know I was wrong. But this house loved you. And you loved me, too. Don't be so cruel." I looked at her. I felt no anger. Not because I pied her, but because my heart had already grown cold. What is broken cannot be mended. Spilled water cannot be gathered. A phrase had never seemed so true as in that moment. I replied softly, "I don't want to blame anyone. But if I remain silent after what you did to my father and me, I would be failing myself." She burst into tears and grabbed my hand. "Give me a chance to make it up to you. Clara, I don't want to lose you." I gently pulled my hand away. "I haven't lost anything. And neither have you. We are simply no longer family." At that moment, Ethan came out of the living room. He was wearing a wrinkled and disheveled white shirt as if he hadn't slept for several nights. His eyes were bloodshot, and he walked with an unsteady gait. Seeing me, he said in a trembling voice, "Clara, please, let's talk." I stood still. It was the moment I had to listen to in order to close this chapter. Ethan approached and stopped a few feet from me. His shoulders were slumped like someone who had lost all their strength. "I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. I got carried away. I was afraid of my mother. I was afraid of Mr. Ortiz." I managed a smile. It was the most cowardly apology I had ever heard. "Ethan, you were afraid of other people. But you were never afraid of losing me. I was your wife. The person by your side." I swallowed, feeling a lump in my throat. "But when my father died, you were at a resort holding hands with another woman. When I was collapsing from grief, you were trying to kill my father to take his assets." Ethan broke down, crying. It was the choked sob of a man who has lost everything. "Clara, I was blind. I was truly wrong. Give me a chance to make it up to you." I shook my head. I wasn't angry or resentful. There was simply nothing left to protect. "Ethan, throughout this entire marriage, I was never a real wife for a single day. I always lived in fear of being judged, of being ignored, of upsetting your mother. And you never, not once, were my refuge." I opened my bag and took out the papers I had prepared that morning. These are the divorce papers I've already signed. You just have to sign. Ethan took a step back. His look was one of panic. No. Don't do this. I can change. I promise I'll love you. I'll leave my mother. I closed my eyes for a few seconds and opened them again. My voice was so calm. It surprised even me. Ethan, you can wake someone who is sleeping, but not someone who is pretending to sleep. The love that bound us. You buried it yourself. My mother-in-law collapsed to the ground, crying. Clara, I beg you. I truly regret it. I bent down and helped her up. My voice was very soft. But every word was clear. Do you regret it because you care for me or because you're afraid of going to jail? My mother-in-law froze. I stood up and looked at them both, at the two people who were once my family. I no longer blame anyone. But I have to leave here. I have chosen to live my own life. Without giving them time to say anything else, I went into the room and collected the few clothes I had left. My in-laws didn't allow me to bring things from outside, so I had barely any belongings here. When I came out, Ethan was still in the yard, watching me in silence. I paused for a moment, but then I walked past him as if passing through a door that was closed forever. When the gate closed behind me, I heard my mother-in-law fall and Ethan call my name. But everything faded behind me like the echo of a nightmare. I walked down the long path that led to my father's house, pulling my suitcase. Each step was lighter, freer, as if the stone that had oppressed my life for years had finally been lifted. I told myself, Clara, you made the right decision. I had put an end to that hellish marriage. But I still had one last thing to do. To end their crimes once and for all. That path still awaited me. After officially leaving my in-laws' house, I returned to my father's side. The house he had built in his youth felt strangely warm. The gentle aroma of lotus blossom tea. The sound of Peter sweeping the patio. The footsteps of Mark coming and going to care for my father. All of it made me feel like this was my place. But I knew perfectly well that it wasn't all over. The guilty still had to face justice. And my father would personally see to it that everything was made clear. A few days later, the police called for an official confrontation. I went with my father and Mark. The sky was overcast with dark clouds swirling as if foreshadowing a long and difficult investigation. When we entered the room, I saw Ethan sitting next to his lawyer, his face pale. My mother-in-law was haggard, her hair disheveled. Father Michael was no longer wearing a cassock, but a prison uniform. An image that made me think bitterly of karma. No one looked at me, and no one dared to look my father in the eye. My father walked to his chair and sat down with the firm posture of someone who had been preparing for this moment for a long time. The inspector opened a file and said in a clear voice, "The confrontation between Mr. Matthew Harrison and the accused begins." The room fell into a dead silence where even the sound of turning pages could be heard clearly. The inspector read, "According to the statement of the accused, Ethan Miller, I only followed my mother's orders. My mother told me that if my father-in-law held all the power, I would have no future. Do you acknowledge this statement?" Ethan lowered his head and answered in a whisper, "Yes." My father looked at him. His gaze was calm but piercing. "Ethan, I loved you like a son. If you had wanted to leave the company, I would have let you go gladly. But you and your mother chose the path of killing me to steal what wasn't yours." Ethan didn't dare to look up, just sobbed quietly, his hands trembling on the table. The inspector addressed my mother-in-law. "According to the evidence gathered, you actively contacted Mr. Ortiz to plan the accident. What do you have to say about that?" My mother-in-law burst into tears. But she no longer had her former arrogance. I only did it for my son. Mr. Harrison. He always looked down on my son and me. I just wanted to give my son a place. I didn't know it would end like this. My father responded instantly. His voice sounded more sad than angry. I never looked down on you. That was just your perception. I simply didn't give power to someone who lacked the ability to wield it. That was my responsibility. My mother-in-law was stunned. A simple truth she had twisted with her resentment for years. The inspector continued. Father Michael, you received money from Eleanor Miller and Mr. Ortiz to create fake ashes. Do you admit it? Father Michael trembled, wringing his hands. I admit it. The inspector went on. And you received an additional payment for advising the family to speed up the funeral to eliminate any traces. He hung his head. Yes. I was a fool. Money blinded me. Hearing this, I shuddered. Greed was sometimes more dangerous than a knife. My father sat up straight. His voice resonated clearly. I expect the law to judge the guilty accordingly. There should be no leniency because I was the victim. Nor should their crimes be covered up because they were once my family. I looked at my father and suddenly burst into tears. This was my father. A man who had lived his whole life with righteousness and kindness and who, despite being on the verge of death, had not lost his dignity. Ethan jumped up. His voice was choked. Father-in-law. Father-in-law. Please give me a chance. I was wrong. I have no face to look at you. But please at least lighten my mother's sentence. I turned to look at him. There was no trace of affection left in my eyes. Only an exhausted sadness. Ethan. When they locked me in that warehouse to kill me, did you think of me? Ethan froze, put his hands on his head, and collapsed back into his chair. The inspector finished taking notes, and concluded the confrontation. This case will now move to the prosecution phase for attempted murder, kidnapping, asset seizure, and conspiracy to cover up a crime. His words sounded like the tolling of a bell, confirming the complete downfall of those who had sided with evil. My father stood up, turned to me, and said, Clara, from now on, everything will be resolved according to the law. You don't have to worry anymore. I took his hand. Dad, I just want you to be at peace. Let's live quietly. Just the two of us. My father smiled sweetly. Yes, sweetheart. We've weathered the storm. As we left the room, I turned back one last time. Ethan's head was bowed. My mother-in-law was sobbing. And Father Michael was sitting stunned, as if he had lost his soul. It was all the price they had to pay. Outside, the sky was beginning to clear and a ray of sunlight illuminated the hallway as if opening a new path in my life. An old chapter had closed and a new life awaited me. The case against my father's assailants was resolved quickly. And in just over a month, the court delivered its initial verdict. The mastermind, Mr. Ortiz, received the maximum sentence. Father Michael was found guilty of fraud, document forgery, and obstruction of justice. My mother-in-law and Ethan were sentenced to prison for conspiracy to commit attempted murder and kidnapping. When I heard the verdict in the courtroom, I felt neither joy nor satisfaction. I only felt that the heavy stone that had been pressing on my chest was finally lifted. Some wounds never heal. But at least justice had sided with the innocent. My father, who sat beside me throughout the trial, maintained a very serene expression. As we walked down the courthouse hallway, he took my hand warmly, just like when I was a little girl. Clara, I no longer hold a grudge against anyone. Despite everything I've been through, I still have you by my side. And that's enough. I rested my head on his shoulder and felt my heart lighten. A chapter of my life filled with darkness had closed. And I was on the threshold of a different future. After that, my father's company regained its stability. He stepped back from frontline management, leaving the direction in the hands of the board and taking on only an advisory role. With the shares he had transferred to me, I had decision-making power. But my father was clear. You don't have to do it all. Just live your life the way you want, with joy and in peace. I agreed. After everything that had happened, I had learned that no matter how harsh this world is, if you keep a clean heart, if you know how to love others and yourself, no one can extinguish your inner light. One sunny afternoon, for the first time, after so many incidents, I cooked dinner for my father. The kitchen filled with the aroma of lentil soup, baked fish, and vegetables freshly picked from the backyard garden. My father ate slowly, looking at me from time to time with a tender smile. They may not have wanted you as a daughter-in-law, but as my daughter, I will give you all the love you were missing. I laughed, but tears escaped, not of sadness, but of gratitude. That night, standing on the porch, I looked up at the starry sky and thought about everything that had happened. The marriage full of wounds, the fight against the wicked, and the journey to find myself again. And now I was where I should have been from the beginning, a woman who knows her own worth, who knows her limits, and what truly matters. Tomorrow, I would start again. Maybe I would open a small shop or learn something I had always loved, but never dared to try. I didn't want a grand life. I just wanted a life that was truly at peace. Outside, the wind blew through the trees, making a whispering sound that sounded like a blessing from the heavens. I closed my eyes, and not addressing anyone in particular, perhaps just myself, I whispered, "Clara, from now on, be truly happy." The chapter of an era had closed, and that of a new life had just begun.